All right, so welcome everyone to Friday night Hoshinden Philosophy and Theory talk. Sylph Dominic Hawkins here, coming to you live on Friday, the 11th of September 2020. And this is session something 19 or something crazy in the second set, in the phase 2 of Hoshinden Philosophy and Theory talks. So it's been a long time this lockdown has been running on for. I hope that you're well and you've had a good week, and that the warmth of the weather has just helped soften your heart. It certainly has mine. It has made this whole experience ever slightly more bearable. That the leaves are green and the chickens are happy and there's just warmth in the air. So tonight, I had originally, following our little set, talk about the opposing phases. A few weeks ago, I started talking about the relationships between water and fire phase, then the relationships between earth and wind phase. That was the primary the primary phases. And then last week, I started talking about the metal and mist phase and their relationship. And tonight, I should have moved on to talk about lightning and clay phase, but I'm going to move that to next week, because I want to just go over again and clarify what the actual goal is of martial arts. Because in a whole bunch of news and politics during this week and the situation we find ourselves in, I think it would be prudent to just clarify what is it that I see as the primary goal and function of martial arts. And then that might help to clear up what it is that I think these series of discussions are doing, and what it is that they're actually working towards. While at this time where we can't just get together at the dojo and continue with our taijutsu study, or our general martial arts study in the flesh. So martial arts, we've got to remember that martial arts comes from all kinds of different contexts all around the world, all kinds of different environmental contexts and historic contexts, and that they are so varied. They're as varied as the number of martial arts that there are. So certain contexts where there was a lot of suppression of experience, you get martial arts that are born out of that. Contexts where the martial arts were the dominant art of, say, the military or the state, you get certain martial arts that bear out of that. As the centuries roll on and they pass down through generation to generation, doesn't matter how much they might change in the context of their new presentation, maybe it's 400 years later, there are aspects of those arts that will still be presented from the original influence, and that'll just be inherent to what the art is and what the art does and how it does its thing. An example like capoeira is a great example, how the Japanese Brazilians or the Japanese migrants and the Brazilians get together and you end up with that like long-term BJJ thing. But way previous to that, you get capoeira as a fighting form that was taught in kind of like, from my understanding, like an undercover dance experience from the slaves who were working on the farms, plantations. And it's an opportunity for them to practice fighting, to explore their martial art under a type of duress or in a particular climate where they couldn't just get together and practice down on the corner in the park. And we've seen this in lots of different experiences through history. It's different epochs. In Japan, it's very maybe not well known, but well documented towards the end of the 1800s, and then spill over into the start of the 1900s and the 20th century. There's a huge lockdown and clampdown on the study of martial arts, and even far out direct orders for persecution and execution surrounding people who were practicing certain arts that were blacklisted by the powers that be, or to be like soliciting for members, or to be getting together to promote those particular arts. Arts that were not in favor, for whatever reason. And so again, you find that, obviously the context of those things changes. And the samurai arts are really interesting because you have this weird cross-section of some arts that were, they were samurai families and lineages that held positions of power. And so they were very public, you know, they didn't need to act in any particular secrecy. But if they just happened to be on the losing side of the feudal civil wars or the samurai civil war, and then they found themselves, you know, having to escape whatever, murder or oppression by the victors, well, suddenly in a very short period of time, like maybe just a matter of months, the art that was previously just public knowledge and there were no restrictions in the presentation of that, becomes something that's now subject to a lot of scrutiny. And so very quickly, you know, these things change and adapt. And that would be really, I imagine that would be very hard to make those kinds of adaptations into the art, especially if the art has very like forward-moving aggressive components. Well, those are going to be the first to have to be looked at in the art, because it's going to have to say, ooh, we might need to pull back on those in order to survive long term, or we might need to review how it is we go about our kind of sense of identity is not quite the right word, but our sense of camaraderie, you know, or our sense of teamwork or belonging to a particular group, when that it's suddenly just decided that it's not a fun thing, or it's not the okay thing to do. So this isn't new, you know, like this has happened all throughout history in different ways. And one of the things that I think martial arts has done exceedingly well at is being able to clarify and clearly articulate and then teach and continue the presentation of through generations really key skills and talents around survivability. And it isn't necessarily directed towards any particular type of politics or any particular type of great world domination goals or anything like that. You know, martial arts and martial art lineages have never, ever been in a position of that kind of power. Maybe in old school Japan, it could have been considered as such with the warring lords and the samurai families that worked with them, but certainly not. You know, there's never been like, this is the small ninja group who took over the world. Like that never happens, and it will never happen, because the arts themselves are aligned to individuals and small groups. They're not aligned to large groups and organizations. And so the strategies and tactics that are taught, presented, are around the surviving and the interests and the development, personal development of individuals and small groups. They're not aligned into the strategies and tactics of large countries and large organizations. And so they just don't work on that platform. They'd have to be changed in such a way that, in order to be applied on that level, that they would look very little like the original lineage or the original art. And so if we get down to this idea of like, what is it martial arts is for? Primarily the arts that I study, the arts that I teach, and certainly the art that Rainsford Dojo is the headquarters of, is all around this simple question: how do you survive long term and well? And then a second set is like, if surviving, how do you thrive? And then the third question is like, if thriving, how do you maintain consistent thrivability? So it comes automatically as a package with a whole bunch of skills, a real interest in the development of the individual. Because as an individualized art, its interest says, okay, or its interest are in saying, if you as an individual, and let's say that maybe you're the sole inheritor of a particular, of a lineage of art form, you're like, that would be probably quite, the pressure of that would be overwhelming. The questions are like, well, you know, who are you as an individual who deserves to be in that position? And what is it that you use as a reference and a model against your own values and morals to decide that you are continually someone who deserves that position? You know, so there's kind of this expectation of some form of continual personal development in terms of introspection or skills and practice development. so that you, not just on a physical level, you're not just, you know, developing further as a martial artist physically, but also with your wisdom and your mature understanding of the application of martial arts. When is a correct time to apply certain things? When is a terrible time to apply certain things? And so there's this ongoing sort of development that's almost expected, you know, certainly by the heads of those styles, but even, I would say, even down to the individuals at the bottom level, people who just enter martial arts and they've never been involved in martial arts ever before, and they walk in, and there should be the same level of kind of subtle expectation that there's introspection and reflection on the values and the morals and the moral compass and the silent and quiet motivations of the individual, all the way from the white belts who walk in right up to, you know, the head of the school who's been there for 100 years. And so that kind of thing is that's just standard. You know, you don't find in martial arts, you shouldn't find a particular discrepancy between the values and the morals that are expected of the higher individuals overall in terms of their character, in comparison to the brand new beginning students. It should be relatively uniform, and so therefore you get this model where those who are holding their positions and their ranks, they hold them not just out of, you know, pieces of paper for time of study, but out of genuine development and demonstration of that position that they're entitled to hold. And then they become role models of, you know, the next group under them, and so on and so on and so on. And so in that, martial arts is like, well, moving forward, if the art is about thriving, and if in 100 years from now I will be dead, I'll just put that out there, it's my assumption, then it's like, what is it that is going to be passed on to future generations? If I, as the head of a particular style of thinking, are contorting and twisting that thinking towards nothing but my own personal gain, then what is it that is going to be left to hand over? Because if it's not something that's broad enough and kind of human enough in its base to be experienced by and explored by individuals throughout humanity, you know, onward into the future, then it's very likely not going to survive. It's just something that's going to exist, you know, for my lifetime as a pet little fun activity, and then with my demise, it vaporizes because it was too difficult to apply to just the general experience of humanity or whatever. You know, if I've contorted it and twisted it to be very specific to, say, my own political agenda or my own idea of, you know, some lord of power over the dojo and walking in gold rings and all that kind of jazz, it's not going to survive. So that kind of changing would undermine its value and its utilitarian application. You know, if you're really interested in art as like the art as a long-term experience, it kind of suggests that you yourself, involved in that experience, you have to be able to see it as like a framework and a vehicle to allow others to experience the same kind of things that you might have. So the things that Hoshin has done for me, the benefits and the experiences that I have gained from Hoshin and Bujinkan, you know, over the last 20 years, those are things that I'm like, oh, I love those. I really revere those. Those experiences have really been key, crucial aspects in the development of my character and my experiences, and have led me around the world, you know, in my interactions with others, and have really contributed to the development of a lot of my thought and my thinking, and therefore the actions I take. So I think, well, I was so lucky that I experienced a lot of that from the framework of the art. As a custodian of the art, how is it that I can look to allow the same continuation, not allows the wrong word, look to support maybe the same continuation, so that, 100 years after I've died, there might be other people who equally benefit from that, in the same way that I inherited the study and the art form from my teachers, and they too from theirs. I know that 200 years ago, there was not an individual who was really clear that in the year, 2000, there's going to be a prophetic, an individual called Sylph Dominic Hawkins. Like, they were just doing their thing. They were just living in whatever context they were living in. And once they passed on that art, or once they died, it's out of their hands. Like, that's gone. And so if the art itself was kind of, or the survival of the art as a framework was then entirely dependent on the character of the inheritor. And if the art is really interested in its own, long-term survival and development as a framework, then it needs to be able to structure itself in such a way that its inheritors can pick it up and experience their own, they can see their own reflection in it, and then they can use it as a framework and vehicle to have their own experiences. And if they're motivated, or if they're interested, if they're inspired to then do something with that and to teach or to continue that as a lineage of study, then they do so, hopefully, out of a realization of the benefits that it has brought to them, and their hope and desire that others might benefit from that in the future. And again, it's like, once that leaves that individual, it's that's as far as they can influence. So you would think that as the head of those styles, or as the custodians of those styles for your little generation of time, that your interest would really be in not necessarily what are my personal goals, how can I use the framework to advance my own personal experiences. Sure, that all goes on for all humans, but if you really actually have an interest in the art, the question has to be reversed as well. And it's like, well, in what ways can I contribute to the development of this as an art form? In what ways can I contribute in such a way that in 100 years from now, there is still a framework like this, with access to the information and the understanding and the activities, the practices of development in 100 years from now, so that someone in a far off future might reap the benefits that I have reaped, and so on and so on and so on. It's that old adage of, I say, the society that works well is the one where the elderly plant trees whose shade they know that they will never sit in. And it's a beautiful concept, it kind of suggests an actual interest in the framework of a society and an appreciation for the benefits that it has brought to those citizens, those individuals, so that the framework itself can exist for the benefit of the future generations. Knowing that those individuals, especially the elderly in that society, they will be long dead before they reap the benefits of the avocado trees or whatever, the nut fields or the great oak tree shade. And it's this kind of passing on. It's quite, we see that right through our human culture, and it's quite an incredible idea, because it is far beyond this idea of, if you think about what it is that we have sort of a handle over, it's a very short period of time in terms of the human life expanse. Let's say like let's average 100-year, although it's really like an 80-year average, but we'll say 100-year run. It's not a long period of time to, go out and do everything you want to do and exert all of your efforts towards whatever the goals are you want, and you're going to climb Mount Everest, and you're going to build an empire, and you're going to find gold at the bottom of the ocean, and you're going to have 400 children, like whatever. I don't know. Everyone's got all their different goals. It's not a lot of time to, on top of those, be interested in the concerted development of the framework that you inherited that gives rise to those opportunities, and then a future interest in others. That is a very, I wouldn't say strange, but like, it's a very specific type of care. It's a very specific type of futurism in a way that isn't necessarily, it isn't so much about hoping that the framework, must survive, because ultimately you're like, well, if the framework isn't benefiting anyone, then the framework is pointless. If the art genuinely just caused nothing but harm and misery to the individuals involved, then it's like, well, then the art should probably just vanish, because the art isn't of any use, to any of the members of it. So why would it be continued? Why would it be propagated? Other than for whatever, some individual benefit, but not really an interest in what the art can do for others. And so martial arts, in the way that it's traveled over the centuries, wrapped up in all of its teachings, are tools and skills that are designed to allow itself to perpetuate as a framework, and to kind of, I say, manipulate and adapt its inheritors' feelings and skill set and thinking in a way that allow its inheritors to be able to, I don't know what the right word is, not correctly, but I don't even know what the word is, to allow the inheritors to actually further impart that again. If the arts were some unbelievable, incredible collection of skills and understanding and knowledge and wisdom, but there was just a repository, like a library, and it didn't actually teach anyone to read the books, then it's like all that it will have value to, the only reason it will have value are for maybe the people who created it in the first place, who could read. And then everyone else who can't read, they have this great building full of books. It serves as nothing more than a symbol, which might be useful in its own right, but the actual information that it contains is now irrelevant. If the people who inherit it haven't also had to develop skills to interpret it, or the skills to be able to relay that information, or even scrutinize and develop it, then it kind of just becomes this stagnant thing, over time. And so martial arts pass down skills of whatever the context were, whatever the cultural context that it came from. So, feudal Japan, it's like skills of weaponry, defenses and attacks, and techniques that are directly in response to the fighting techniques of some other rival clan, and blah, 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 blah. So you've got all that. But the individuals who inherit it, they also need to know how to actually live, because it's no good to the art as a framework if the people who inherit it die 2 weeks later because they don't know how to cook and they can't eat, or if they die because they're so foolish that they make rash decisions that just endanger their lives, so that 9 times out of 10 should have died, and in that one time it turns out that jumping out of a plane without a parachute actually really wasn't a great idea. Well, then obviously the art would perish with them. And so it teaches, it really has to teach, along with its physical prowess, basic strategy in terms of long-term interest, and it's not surprising that what I find is when I am in conversation with friends, colleagues, teachers, my own teachers, colleagues who have been studying a lot longer than I have, certainly, 50 years, 60 years, the common thread that I see is this very specific interest in long-term things. They seem to be very easily able to talk about 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. Interests, hopes, dreams about the future, ideas and goals, very long-term. Their strategies tend to be more long-term than short-term. Their financial goals are very long-term. Their whole development of things are quite long-term. And even though they might be dealing with short-term issues, overall they have quite a long-term level of thinking. And I really wonder whether that is directly, and sure they might have had that in their character to start with, but whether it's at least in a large part because of the way that they've been taught to think from the arts or by the arts that they are so heavily involved in. And that is for the arts benefit as a framework. So I often think of, there's a funny idea. I remember coming across this in a funny permaculture lecture that I was involved in. And there was a great ecologist who made this comment saying, maybe the tomato plant was so smart, it made itself so tasty that humans would spend our time, money, resources, and effort propagating tomatoes across every country and it's just one example, every country of every inch of the globe, because we think, oh, it's great, it's, we love this thing, we want to grow it, but really it's actually a great plot by the tomatoes to further their own, to kind of ensure their own long-term survival. And I laughed, and we were talking to the guy afterwards, because it was just a funny sort of idea that, imagine if the tomatoes as a plant group had this really long-term plan of ensuring their survival long-term by convincing the people who eat them that the people like, I feel so internally motivated to continue planting this thing. It's just accidentally to the success of the tomato plant. And so the martial arts have the same idea. It's like, if they can kind of convince, coerce, suggest to their inheritors that their inheritors themselves might be really internally motivated to spend their own time, energy, money, and resources into furthering the seeds and the development of that framework around the globe and whatever into the future. It's what an ingenious, maniacal long-term plan on behalf of the art. Just like the tomatoes are laughing all the way to the bank. They didn't have to get on a plane. They didn't have to book the plane or build the plane. The humans did it for them. And then we spread them all around the, the globe. So martial arts and how it kind of presents itself, it should be quite enthralling. And I don't just mean on a physical level or entertaining. I mean, it should be quite awe-inspiring. It really drops you to your knees at certain points in what it is that it shows you about yourself. And the skills and the learning that you gain along the way. And when you really see yourself developing, and then you see your life getting better in whatever regard, as a result of your study, it's like it starts to dwell that internal desire to not only continue being involved, but eventually, if you end up in a position where you're responsible, it's like, it breeds this internal motivation, internal inspiration for you to continue it. And because what's involved in it are all the activities, the next generation of people that you kind of become exposed to that, some of them will have the same kind of experience, and they'll be like, I don't know why, but I'm really keen to just spend lots of my time and money developing, traveling, spreading this idea, talking to others, collaborating, communicating, further developing what my understanding is, writing books. It's like the number of books there are in martial arts are just incredible. And you think, well, the books can't just be about physical techniques, because there's a limited number of physical techniques. I mean, if you look at the human body, it's like the wrist only rotates in that. It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from or what era of history you live in or any of your specific epigenetics. If you're a human being, there's the wrist. And maybe there's a small subsection of society who are like contortionists, who have a slightly extended range of motion in the wrist. But that's it. And so if you're developing martial art techniques or response techniques to manipulating the wrist and then manipulating the spine using the wrist as a lever, well, you're going to run out of options pretty quickly. You're like, well, we can do this thing, and we can do that thing, and we can do that thing, and we've kind of got some of these, and we've got these things. And then maybe 2 pages in, that's it, you're done. So you're like, well, you can't possibly write a couple of million books if all the books are doing are replicating the same set of physical techniques. So everyone, what's mixed into them all are their own particular flavor of the underlying philosophy, or their own particular flavor of the values, at heart. And the techniques will demonstrate that. And so certain techniques, certain schools of study will be super like aggressive, very authoritarianly aggressive, forward moving, pushing, driving, and that they might reflect the character traits that are really, that they're actually interested in promoting, you know, because it's very hard to be able to apply those kinds of martial techniques without getting your mind into the state of the goal or the application. So it's very hard to be very timid and extremely shy and very nervous and very soft, and then apply correctly really aggressive, dominating techniques. You know, so the study of that slowly teaches and adds character trait opportunities for individuals, so that the really timid, shy individual might be able to embody or touch on the ability to be a little bit more forceful, or to stand up for something, or to be a little bit more aggressive and forward moving. And then conversely, arts that are like, okay, we're going to be super soft. It's all going to be liquid, watery, windy, turning, you know, very defensive, only defensive. Those arts will give an opportunity for the individuals who study them, who are naturally super aggressive and driving and dominant and forward moving, give an opportunity for them, because you cannot apply some of those techniques. Your own dominance and aggression kind of stands in the way of your ability to liquefy or to yield under pressure, which will be part of how the technique works. That you put yourself in a position, and then you take weight, and then you yield to the weight, and then change angle to collapse the basis that the attacker was standing on. And in order to do that legitimately, in a way that, you know, the attacker actually considers is realistic, you have to be able to get yourself into the mind frame where you are honestly yielding in some sort of form of softness in that moment. Doesn't necessarily mean that you take that on as a life path, you know, but you yield because you learn how to yield, because you have to learn how to apply the technique correctly. And so it's like, it can teach all sides of these equations, and not any of them are particularly correct. None of them is the right way, you know. Tomorrow it might be very important to be yielding, and then the day after it might be very important to be assertive, and then the day after that it might be a neutral day. And so there's this constantly moving sea, and this ocean between shores. So if we go back to talking about how martial arts does that, what it does is it presents through its martial art techniques character traits that are required in order to apply the techniques successfully and correctly, you know, with vigor and with good outcome. And so the very study of those techniques leads slowly to the development of certain character traits in the individuals. And most arts that I have looked at, that I have experienced in, they have all kinds of different techniques. You know, they aren't just aggressive and they aren't just defensive. There are combinations of techniques, and there's times in techniques where the study forces you to be initially defensive and then quite assertive, or initially assertive and then yielding. And so the martial arts kind of present this balanced idea of, you don't know what skill set you're going to need for tomorrow, so probably best that you just gain a wide repertoire. You know, if you don't know what all of the problems are going to be that you need as a house handyman, it's probably a good idea to just get as many tools as you can get your hands on, and skill yourself in as many different tools and methods as possible, so that you can put your hand to any of you can problem solve any of the issues, you know. So the way that the martial art kind of, it's like, if you imagine it, it's going to sound strange, imagine like how a parasite or a pathogen would alter the environment that it finds itself in order to better its survival. That, you know, those strange stories about certain parasites where they lead humans, like there's a cat, I was reading one about cat feces and how it has been shown to slightly alter brain chemistry to make the individuals really quite positive towards cats, really love cats, you're really drawn to cats. It's like, that's a great idea. What a fantastic little mechanism to ensure the survival of cats. And we say, oh, tomatoes are super tasty. Is the tastiness of tomatoes an inherent way that the tomato plant has ensured its success? Because if the tomato plant was just disgusting, with no particular use whatsoever, to us, if it picks us as the primary distributor, then is that really going to be of any particular benefit to the tomato plant long term? So the framework should be appealing, but then during the process, maybe some extra things happen that you didn't expect. So, for example, a lot of people get involved in martial arts because and this is depending on a lot of people get involved in the arts that I have studied, I have found, because either they have experienced some kind of bullying, or they have quite low self-esteem, or they're very shy, they're very timid, or they've been on the losing side of a fight, or they've had some scare, like a particular, that they might have been approached, and they're all a bit jittery. And so those people, they look for martial arts initially from the perspective of self-defense. So like, oh, I want to learn something that's going to help me feel confident. I want to learn street fighting and something that's going to really help me stand up and fight back. And that might be the motivation initially that kind of compels the individual to look out, to even Google martial arts in my area or whatever, when before that event, they might have never even considered that. And then they might enter from that perspective. But what martial arts should do is that over time, the motivations that they entered with will be under review constantly by themselves, the more that they learn and study and discover different aspects of a martial art, and discover that there's a lot more going on than just say, I'm feeling downtrodden, I want to go and learn how to stand up for myself, so I'm going to go and learn some street fighting. And maybe the individual has this kind of vengeful, revenging, I'm going to get my revenge on the people who bullied me through high school or whatever. But then halfway through that study, whatever time, maybe a couple of years in, they cannot shake the discovery that they are able to have that experience in ways that were beyond their understanding, so that they could actually feel quite incredibly powerful without ever laying a punch on anyone, and that they could demonstrate their power in their human interdynamics without actually utilizing any of the physical street fighting or the martial arts that they've studied. And it's like, okay, that's starting to be a different, what they entered, the motivation that they entered with starts to change over time through the study. And I really think that that's because the study itself, it engages with you as in a relationship. So it's like, it's often said that the first 10 years of study you spend studying your teacher. And then it's not until after that first 10 years that you begin to be able to actually dialogue in a relationship yourself with the art. So for the first 10 years, you just mimic your teacher, copy the way that they're moving. Obviously you're learning. It's like you go to a music class and you never played guitar before, and the teacher's telling you directly where to place your fingers, how to hold the instrument, what to do, the methods for getting into rhythm and following beat. And at that point, you have no personal experience in guitar maybe before, or music in general. And so you do have to be, you're just the good student. You become at the total, like a sponge of that information. Over time, as you start playing guitar and you follow your teacher's advice, and then you start discovering that, well, I started there, but my arms are a slightly different length to my teacher's, or I kind of prefer a different type of guitar, a short one, a long one, the fretboard's wider or whatever. I don't know. You start to deviate from what it is that your teacher presents. And you do it by initially adapting for your circumstances. So if your teacher is very tall and you're quite short, you initially attempt to mimic the technique and the study and even the character traits of the teacher from their perspective. And slowly over time, you start to find there's little extra hints and tricks and ways that you have to move or present the work in order to make it more applicable to yourself because you're shorter. Or vice versa, your teachers, are short and stocky and you're really tall and thin. You will start off, mimicking your teacher and copying that. And over time, you'll have to adapt it because you're just not short and stocky. You're tall and thin. You'll start finding that there's little ways that you can manipulate it. And as you do, you start engaging and developing your own personal relationship with the art itself. So when that happens, what happens at that point is that you're still a student of your teacher, obviously, kind of like infinitely, in terms of they'll always be ahead on the path of you. But you're, in effect, they've taught you a language that you have the opportunity then to actually go and use the language to dialogue with the art, life or the martial art. And in that dialoguing, you can learn new words and you can gain greater insight, things that your teacher didn't teach you or indirectly maybe might have shown or commented on, but it wasn't something that they were ever focused on, so therefore it's not something they ever brought to the forefront. Or they're very short and stocky, so they never really had to concern themselves with the difference of the center of gravity or how that it was easier to throw the taller individual. They had to adapt their structure in that way. And so you'll end up with everyone tweaking it and contorting it. And most people just stop there. Most people continue their study, make adaptations to their teachers, and then just kind of travel at this parallel path. So, and that's fine. But what the next opportunity after that in this kind of engaging relationship with the martial art as a framework is this dialogue and discussion. So the dialoguing through martial arts, and that either happens through forms of meditation as a practice, or even just through self-observation, say in classes or in technique study, and I'm sure that everyone who studies martial arts would have this experience, when you suddenly discover that there's a new way of doing something, and it's really subtle, but it changes everything that you've ever done. And you look back and you realize that for the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, you've been studying techniques, whatever, you've been doing well, but now you suddenly have just stumbled upon the idea that you could have your foot slightly differently, or you could be punching not just from your torso, but you could really be punching so that you can feel the pressure in your feet against the ground, as you strike, or this wave from your hip out through your arm in the strike. And you realize that means you have to go back and deconstruct and rebuild everything. And it's a simple little concept, but you're like, oh my God, I have to go back and rebuild everything. And it's like, why do you rebuild it? It's out of this thirst for perfection, this thirst for engaging more. It's like this elusive lover that's constantly just, holding a carrot, and you're constantly kind of just out of reach. And so you're inspired and motivated to grow and develop and change and learn and study. And you take things that you kind of only really understood them 70%, and then you feel really desiring to grasp them at 90%. And then you get that and you settle in, and then you want 95%, and then you want 98%, blah, 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 blah. So it's this self-perpetuating cycle. And what tends to happen is that then at that level, at that point, those individuals, it spans out beyond that. They start observing that, wait, this isn't just in martial arts, that maybe the way that I've been moving now with something I know that I've learned recently is going to make the way I've been moving the whole time more efficient, or the effect is going to be 10 times the effect that it's ever had with half the work and effort. Usually it doesn't take much time for that to ripple across into mental activities, emotional experiences and relationships, where they're like, oh, wait a minute, there have been ways that I've been responding to circumstances the whole time for the last however many decades. And, you know, it's kind of like, I've always felt maybe 60, 70%. Most of the time that's worked. It's just been luck. And now I've just discovered some way of I don't know, dealing with someone's criticism of it. I'm just picking out things out of the blue, which took half the effort and had 3 times the effect positively, you know, in my benefit. And you go, wow, I can see how I've been engaging in this way for 30 odd years, but now I know I could just tweak it in this thing and it would be massively different. And those individuals, that's when then they start to write books, you know, martial art books, and their biographies and literature around, you know, the mapping of martial arts and human development or character development, character trait, you know, alterations through the study of martial arts and how to use martial arts to be a better boss, you know, how all the art of war, like the Sun Tzu, the book is well known for being mostly bought by martial artists and business executives. And you're like, huh, what is it that the book contains or presents that those 2 individual groups are really interested in? And the answer is strategy and manipulation of others and manipulation of self. So you're like, okay, well, that makes sense. You know, advertising agencies, business CEOs, martial artists, military and politicians are probably really interested in concepts of manipulation, you know, physically, mentally, emotionally, concepts of propaganda, and I mean both for pros and cons, you know, concepts of strategy and how does a small, and martial arts has been this really curious of those kinds of streams of information, and they're rippled right through political change and economic change and diverse issues, you know, globally for thousands of years. And yet somewhere around the world there's, you know, little groups of people teaching. Someone's inspired to teach, other people are inspired to go along and study, and regardless of how the landscape might have changed, there's this little package, this little tomato seed, you know, package that gets delivered and passed on, and it just so happens that it contains things that are of immense interest to a whole bunch of people, but they're little things that get kind of looked over or washed over in big change. You know, when the world moves into huge change, when the Industrial Revolution rolled through, that it was not like, okay, we're going to really need an interest in human interpersonal dynamics. So it wasn't like they went, hang on, let's just hold off on the Industrial Revolution until we can get a really good grip on the strategy of human dynamics and the human relationships and how we're going to manage that. You know, that wasn't on the agenda for the Industrial Revolution. But as so happened with the way that the world changed, it became part of the agenda. But because it wasn't something that was of interest, it wasn't taught by the individuals, so that, you know, it wasn't necessarily a part of early business acumen. And then later, it's like, oh no, we need this. You know, someone works out that their productivity increases, or it's more efficient for them if they actually at least pretend to treat their workers well, you know, in 1910, 1915. And so someone goes, oh great, how do we do that? And they look around, and in their own industry, there's no information. They go to other industries and they find that there are still aspects of that type of philosophy or that type of human psychology that's being taught and kept alive in traditional cultures, or in the propagation of certain religious and spiritual ideas, you know, or in certain like old texts and old books like the Sun Tzu, you know, like the Tao Te Ching, that have really had no interest to those people for millennia. Because it wasn't really part, you know, it was just kind of something over there. suddenly it's realized that it contains information that's been lost in the general industry. And then people flock to it as if it's this new thing, and the way of suddenly someone who, if someone just happened to be, I don't know, an interpreter, a language interpreter, and they happen to write into I like how martial arts just casually in the background, under the cover, away from the gaze of any particular public scrutiny, it just continues to teach and pass on these little tomato seed packages of livability, strategy, human relationships, the development of human interaction towards certain goals, like whether that's some kind of group consensus or like a generalized involvement of individuals to the level where they feel that they have worth and value, and so therefore they want to propagate the framework itself. And again, I'm doing all this completely separate to the face value. The face value of martial arts, the value that's presented to the public, is always the physical art. Street fighting, disarm guns, do cartwheels over cars, grab people by the legs and flip them over a house, and all that kind of stuff, and it's done a good job of promoting itself as an industry through film and through media and through all these kinds of things. And it's like a trap, it ensnares people. And then what you discover in the middle of the trap is that actually martial arts isn't about that at all. Martial arts isn't particularly about doing cartwheels over cars. Like, that's cool, but you discover that far more important are the connections that you make with the individuals and a sense of purpose and possibly methods to being able to answer questions that you have had for a long time, or potentially emotional experiences that just kind of galvanize the center of you, but you can't really put your finger on how or when. It's not like you could say, 5th of January, 2015, I woke up and I just felt invincible. It's like, it's a very slow, general gathering together of the disparate pieces of the individual, until almost like magnetism, just kind of very slowly pulling together, until eventually you realize one day that, maybe not entirely, but in a large part, you feel quite whole, and you feel like bits of you have been brought together, and aspects of you and parts of you that were kind of scattered, with the wind, you've pulled together under your own umbrella, and you do feel able to live the life that you want to live, or contribute in the way you want to contribute. And then out of that, every now and then there's a diamond in the rough who, for whatever reason, says to themselves, I feel really inspired to teach other people about this framework that has been very useful for me, or I don't know why, I can't put my finger on it, but I really just, I live in a little town, and I know a whole lot of people in the town who are maybe would really benefit, I think, from some of the things that the framework can teach, and so I'm going to start a little martial arts school in a scout hall somewhere, etc., etc., etc. And they're just little grassroots movements. None of them are particularly large. Even extremely large martial art organizations are quite small in terms of how they directly influence the world. Very, it's a slow moving influence. And when you get down onto the ground of how that's being done, it's all being done through little groups. And I said little, even like up to a few thousand, sharing ideas, developing and kind of, you know, adding commentary to, and you've got this enormous, almost like decentralized web of interconnected little groups that are promoting and developing and continuing to present their particular interpretation of the work, you know, whatever that is, whatever that might be. And so I find that martial arts, it never develops into, you know, the world-changing trend, because it's like, in order to do so, it would have to lose some of the very unique one-on-one oral tradition, you know, teacher-student pass-down group mutual respect development that's kind of inherent to how it actually operates. If it was to suddenly be laid out as like, this is the new state martial arts, it's like the new state religion, and it's to be taught in all schools in all ways, it's like, that's great, but it will still have individuals forming those relationships at its heart. If it doesn't, it can't, then it just becomes a shadow of its former self, because the things that it's teaching aren't things that you can necessarily just read in a textbook and tick off on a checklist and then move on from, you know. It's very hard to assess and measure the development of an individual's sense of value and purpose, you know. Like, that's difficult. That's not something that you can have an outcome-driven agenda about and say, all students after 8 months will feel confident. You know, some people are going to join from a particular point in their life where they're already feeling great structural confidence. Some people are going to join at a particular point in their life where they're feeling extremely timid, you know, and very wayward. And so you've got these people scattered all across that spectrum. And the art, just its goal is like, just slowly help individuals gather up themselves from wherever it is they enter. You know, if they enter from, and their scattered pieces are just a meter away, then they'll gather them in that meter. If they enter and their pieces are kilometers in diameter, spread, you know, whole chunks of their personality all over the place, slowly as the years roll on, those chunks will come together and form, you know, a solid individual. And then hopefully that individual can go on to contribute to the human society, the human development, regardless of whether they actually then become inspired or interested in furthering the framework that assisted them in that way. So I look at the time, it is time to wrap up that part of the chat. I will call it a night there. I wanted to just really go over that at this particular point in time in our modern history, because again, it's worth remembering that what it is we actually study, what it is that we're studying, are little like tomato seed packets of information and certain types of human wisdom that have been passed down through the ages, and they're not doctrinated wisdoms as such, as much as they are self-observed experiences, you know. So after observing how you respond or relate in a certain way over a certain period of time, you realize there are alternative options, you know, and you come to that yourself. And so the art's interest is like, how can it assist people in coming to those points of their own self-interpretation, their own self-reflection? And then hopefully that will be a benefit to them. Hopefully that will be a benefit to their families, the people who surround them, and then wider rings, there's their community, their surrounding society, their nations, the globe, you know. Because I have no doubt that at some point in the future, you know, it might be a normal experience that there's Earth and another planet in the solar system, or Earth and the space colonies, you know. And so it's like, there's this real proliferation of human thought. And when human thought can be, and human understanding, something that we might have as a culture thought that we really kind of just nailed and it's done now, we ticked that off 200 years ago. Suddenly times change and people forget, you know, and that drops that particular type of thinking, or how common knowledge isn't common at all, how that kind of drops out of mainstream experience for people. Eventually, when they turn around and look for it, turns out that little seed of that philosophy or that idea or that concept or that activity which could foster the development of that idea has actually been maintained. You know, it would be like if people just really decided that they didn't care for tomatoes anymore, whatever, and everyone stopped eating them, and so therefore they stopped selling them, they stopped, you know, growing tomatoes, people stopped saving the seeds, and so the whole tomato industry just slowly evaporates over like a 50-year period. And then 100 years later, someone just happens to be in a, I don't know, a Mexican food market, I can't think of some scenario, and there's this strange looking fruit, you know, what a curious looking kind of red squishy apple thing, sitting, and it just so happens that these people were the descendants of some tomato farmer who loved tomatoes and kept the seeds. And even if the world wasn't interested anymore, that guy was, or that woman was, you know, and that they just, out of their own hobby, kept growing tomatoes, even though everyone was like, come on, man, no one likes tomatoes, give up on it, we're done, we've moved on from tomatoes, now we have potatoes or whatever. And then, but they say, well, no, I don't know, I'm just really inspired about tomatoes, I don't know why, I'm just going to keep doing it, it's my hobby. Yeah. And then slowly, you know, maybe they pass on the seeds, they have 5 children, 4 of the children are like, oh, I hate tomatoes. And 1 of the children are like, I don't know why, but I love tomatoes. And I inherited all these things from my parents. And so I think I might grow some tomatoes. And then 100 years later, there's tomatoes still being grown. You know, I mean, if we take that analogy, I know it's a strange one, how many plant species, how many species of fruit and vegetables are there in relationship to what we see at the supermarket? Like, how many actual species of potatoes are there? I'm pretty sure it's well over 200 or 300 from a thought of mine and a memory of something I'd read. And how many species of carrots are there? Like, actually. And all the different things these carrots do, and how many different tastes. How many different species of tomatoes are there? Wow. Like hundreds of different types of tomatoes. And yet, it's like, that's just, most of them aren't of interest, you know, maybe because the yield they give is so little, it's not commercially viable, or you know, they kind of taste a bit weird and so they're not grown or whatever it is, but they'll guarantee there's someone somewhere, for whatever reason, super interested, inspired as a hobby to further and continue this little seed of information, you know, the tomato, the glowing blue tomato, whatever it is. And then when 100 years rolls by and everyone's like, oh my God, we're really into heritage fruit. Let's go, and we can all now get tomato seeds from the guy who was the only person still growing tomatoes. No one cared about 20 years ago, but now he's a celebrity and famous. Let's go all buy tomato seeds and then re-spread tomatoes. And then maybe 200 years later, everyone's like, God, I'm sick of tomatoes. And then just the cycle continues, you know. Hopefully at the end of the day, as the cycle goes up and down in the trends of society, there will still be individuals who are strangely motivated to grow the tomatoes, save those seeds, even in the face of their own family laughing at them, being like, come on, you're a fool. No one cares about that art or that craft anymore. You know, we've moved on, we're better now, blah, 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 blah. And then they'll kind of accidentally ensure that humans have access to things when we want them at any point in the future. So I'll leave it there. I will wrap up the recording. So for those of you who are in the Zoom and who want to stay on and chat afterwards, stick around and we can have a chat. Otherwise, if you're watching this at home or in the future, I hope you've had a good session and I will see you next time. Bye.